Hello, everyone. This is Emily Brummett with the Colorado Water Congress. And here with Caitlin Coleman with Water Education Colorado, formerly the Colorado Foundation for Water Education. If you haven't heard, we're excited to introduce our new look and name today. We're, of course, excited about these changes and hope that the new name will welcome more Coloradans to benefit from our approach to statewide collaborative independent water education. You can still find us online at yourwatercolorado.org. Thanks, Caitlin. Thanks for joining us today for our joint October webinar on aquatic nuisance species with Water Education Colorado. We'll hear from our speakers about the threat of zebra and quagga mussels and possible solutions for the state of Colorado. The Colorado Water Congress is proud to offer webinars and workshops as benefits to our members in Colorado's water community. You can learn more about the Colorado Water Congress and our upcoming events at www.cowatercongress.org. I have just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. First off, I'd like to thank our speakers and our members. These presentations couldn't be made possible without your support. Today, our speakers include Ken Curtis with Dolores Water Conservancy District, Mike Preston, also with Dolores Water Conservancy District, Doug Krieger with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Aquatic Section Manager, and Doug Vilsack with the Colorado Department of Natural Resources as the Legislative Liaison. If you have any technical questions, please email me at ebrummett@cowatercongress.org. We will have about 10 minutes for questions at the end of the presentation. If you have questions, you can type them into the questions pane in your GoToWebinar toolbar. So that's towards the bottom. And then so as speakers, you'll be muted throughout the webinar just to avoid any feedback. We are recording today's webinar, and it will be available later this afternoon on CWC's YouTube channel. So I will send that out to our attendees. Our first speaker is Ken Curtis. After graduation from Colorado School of Mines, Ken worked for 13 years around New Mexico constructing heavy highway civil projects. Ken next settled down to become the city engineer for booming suburb Rio Rancho, New Mexico for 8 years. Finally, in 2007, he found his calling as the chief of engineering and construction for the Dolores Water Conservancy District in southwest Colorado. Ken leads the district's hydrology operations for McPhee Reservoir operations on Reclamation's Dolores project. Ken also directs major replacement and rehabilitation projects for Dolores project infrastructure. And without further ado, I will pass it off to Ken. So Ken, I have made you the presenter so you can share your screen.
Thanks, Emily. Make sure everybody can hear me, and everybody welcome this afternoon. I really hope I'll be laying the foundation, the impacts, the basics, and background, hopefully so that the water community gets how we all need to be part of the future solutions, and you need to be a leader in your local conversation about this threat, because this transcends East Slope, West Slope, and it affects the whole state, and we're in this together. And the rest of the panel is going to be laying out some great steps, our first steps towards fixing this problem. But for now, let me get into the basics. Real quickly, I do want to recognize that Colorado has been a leader in the ANS area, aquatic nuisance species, for over 10 years with the leadership of Elizabeth Brown and Robert Walters. We've become nationally known for a great program, and I received a lot of info and training over the past 10 years from those two. And with that, I'm going to borrow many of their slides, starting with what are these threats immediately. Generically, we talk about zebra and quagga mussels. But I will tell you, I'm going to focus on the impacts, and it's these invasive characteristics that I'm going to focus on, this rapid reproduction, the byssal threads that are going to highly impact our infrastructure, and finally the filter feeding that really gets after our ecology. And just to be precise, out west from the lower Colorado into Lake Powell, what we're seeing here in Colorado are quagga mussels, which unfortunately are the more aggressive and dominant of the two invasive mussels. Having said that, there's been a lot of study done on where these can survive, and you'll learn very shortly if I am covering the basics for many of you who probably have heard this, but they did start up in the Great Lakes that do freeze over every winter. So they've got a wide range of ability to survive in and thrive in certain conditions, and they will live in our Colorado lakes. Having said that, there's a lot of background study behind this map. And again, I'm only hitting the high points, being that Colorado Parks and Wildlife has monitored all our lakes over many years and come up with the chalk variables. These are the chemical properties of the lakes that allow these mussels to survive. And as you look across the state, our surface waters are highly susceptible to these mussels, and letting them survive and do more than that, just thrive. Having said that, moving on with some of the basics to their life cycle, they do start out in a microscopic veliger stage, and this is particularly significant because we see them brought into Colorado lakes on recreational boats, particularly in the ballast tanks and motors. Later on, they settle out as these juveniles and adults, and it's the adults that ultimately are going to cost us damage to our infrastructure and ecology. So moving right into the adults, they're relatively small, but they do form these dense clusters down at greater depths outside of the light areas, usually on the underside of boats and down on our grates, down on the bottom of our reservoirs. A little bit of quick history. They did come over in ocean-going ships from the Black Sea area, the lower Ukraine. They were introduced into the Great Lakes in the late 80s. And what was found out very quickly, in just 20 years, they invaded the complete Mississippi basin. And what wasn't known at that time is how mobile some of our recreational boats were, and we thought we had a chance of stopping them in the Midwest, but pretty quick, by 2008, they had been discovered down at Lake Mead. And so today we find the heaviest concentrations back in the Mississippi Valley, but they continue to infest new lakes in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, on our eastern edge, and other Midwestern states. But likewise, they are starting to move about the lower Colorado particularly, and were discovered in 2013 in Lake Powell, our closest, one of our Four Corners states. This map is still not showing the most recent findings. Montana was hit last year. The Columbia Basin is doing all they can to protect themselves. They have moved into Canada, and Western Canada likewise is attempting to do what we are, and that's keep them out. And so far the Rocky Mountain states are in relatively safe shape, and we want to keep it that way. So real quick into the background of the invasive characteristics. The first one is a prolific reproduction. We commonly say it only takes one, and potentially one mussel can start an infestation if you get in an adult. And this is what 6 weeks has done down in the lower Colorado. They've been around there less than 10 years or right around 10 years, and anywhere 6 weeks, and you can fully cover any hard surface. What causes the problem? These byssal threads. That allows these mussels to attach to any hard surface. Eventually, this is the kind of thing that they're facing in the lower Colorado and other parts of the Midwest. From shorelines down to their infrastructure. Finally, once you've got millions of these mussels, they start filter feeding. And at first, the water does clear up, and that might not seem like such a bad thing, but it is going to destroy our food chains, and it has some unintended consequences. And ultimately, the municipal providers are really going to have to face this. But one of our neighbors down on the Central Arizona project, we thought they'd have a lot more problem with some of the grates and such, and Parker Dam is down there on the lower Colorado. But one of the unintended consequences for them is the massive amounts of aquatic plant life that's taken off. And they're spending millions of dollars to fight this plant life, and it actually plugs their intakes. Beyond that, you have the harder surfaces and the treatment for all the municipal providers are going to have to do. So at the basic level, we have no viable control methods to date for these mussels in open water, and so we're actively promoting prevention as the best defense. And recreational boats have been the prime vector that we're focusing on. And CPW, back in 2008, set up our initial legislation and our boat inspections for 2009, and they protected Colorado so far to date. But we're in this together. We can't allow them in, otherwise they have a way of propagating through all the state's lakes. So a few specifics on McPhee, not going into every detail, but we have been part of the program since '09. Colorado Parks and Wildlife and the Forest Service has done a great job funding those inspections, but financial problems have come in, and the water district has had to step up to keep the protections up. We feel that we're pretty close to the front line down here in the Four Corners, and we've gone so far as we've had an ongoing local conversation about access control, and that's what's important, or that's one of the important aspects. We are seeking 100% boat inspections, and that's not an easy thing to do, and we've had to shut down 3 local reservoirs owned by private companies, and that has not always been well accepted by the public, as you might expect. But having said that, if you go and see where our Colorado boaters are coming back from Powell, or out-of-state boaters are coming to visit, again, Powell threatens the whole state. One step further from CPW data is mussels have been interdicted all over the state. And when they count the states that they have come in from, they're both from the highly infested Midwest and from the Powell area in lower Colorado. So this impacts all of us, even though we may feel we're a little closer to the border. All our lakes in Colorado have potential problems. So clearly, if you are running a reservoir, you are going to have valve issues and your smaller pipes. This is extremely damaging to cooling water on power plants, and municipal providers all have to deal with this. Again, intake structures are one of the worst. We have ours down at 200 feet deep, and that's always a challenge to get at. Davis Dam has long upped their O&M requirements and their costs. Finally, I mean, this is just going to hit anybody that's working with the water, from the power companies to irrigators, fishermen, and boaters. Real quick, once it takes out the food chain, then we're going to start losing our wildlife. Again, the recreational folks will have some of their own challenges in their fouling of their boats, and we're starting to see these come out of Powell, and there's a loss of some of the houseboats down there. CPW spent months with a quarantined boat down here by Lake Navajo trying to clean it up that came out of Powell. If you're expecting recreation around one of these infested lakes, that's going to drop. So I just want to end, and I know this is going to be talked about by some of our other presenters, and let everybody know why we all have a part to play in this. It's a local conversation about prevention. It's a local conversation about how you're going to do that active boat ramp inspections, which have served the state of Colorado well. And we've got to stick together on this and get the water community out there in that conversation, leading it, because we're either going to be proactive or reactive. We're either going to invest the money up front or we're going to face the consequences of getting infested. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
Thanks, Ken. Our next speaker is Mike Preston. Mike received his bachelor's from University of California at Santa Barbara and a master's in urban and regional planning at the University of Colorado at Denver. Mike has served as the general manager of the Dolores Water Conservancy District since October of 2007 and has served as chairman of the Southwest Basin Roundtable since early 2008. During 25 years with Fort Lewis College, Mike served as the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe negotiating team in the Colorado Ute Indian Water Rights Settlement, and as project development coordinator for the planning and development of the 7,600-acre Ute Mountain Farm and Ranch enterprise. Mike, take it away.
Thank you very much, Emily. Well, as you can see from the presentation that Ken has made, this is a very serious problem, and we're fortunate in that the state of Colorado has set the standard for how you set up inspection programs and ward off these species. The fact that we are mussel-free is something that every citizen of Colorado benefits from for reasons that were made clear in Ken's presentation. Prior to 2017, there was some level of federal participation, but primarily this program was funded by Colorado, through Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and the source of that funding was energy severance taxes. There was a tier 2, which when these taxes were generated, that were available for this type of work. Well, what happened in 2017 is there was no tier 2 severance tax money. The declining production and some changes in some court decisions and everything took the availability of that money out of tier 2, and that left everyone that was actually running one of these inspection programs kind of scrambling as to how we were going to get through 17. So, and if you really, having looked at the damage that these mussels have done, we could have done, if we had not stepped forward and addressed this in 17, we could have severely damaged the inspection program and would have been at high risk for infestation. Fortunately, key parties stepped forward and made sure that didn't happen. And I can't tell you as a reservoir operator how much we appreciate the steps that were taken. First of all, the Colorado legislature stepped forward and put $3.6 million from the general fund into an A&S fund, or into an aquatic nuisance species fund. That was a critical step. The other thing that happened is the federal agencies, some of the federal agencies began to step up more, and we got some more participation from federal agencies that either have ownership or recreational responsibilities on these reservoirs. This commitment from the federal government is something that needs to be increased. The other thing that was done to get through 17, and it turns out 18, is a number of local entities stepped forward and made cost share commitments to the program. So in the case of McPhee Reservoir, we've got a 4-way cost share that supports our program year to year, so that we're all have skin in the game, or kind of sharing this responsibility. The other critical factor in getting us through 17 and 18, on top of the legislative appropriation, the local cost share, the increasing federal contributions, was the fact that the CPW had held some of these tier 2 severance tax funds in reserve, and they were able to take those reserve funds and apply them to 17 and 18. So you add all those things together, we were able to make that through. And I think one critical thing going forward is that we really need to restore, if severance tax money comes back, we really need to restore that reserve as quickly as possible. so that we were prepared if we were to find ourselves in a situation like 17. So all these programs kind of stepped up to get through 17 and 18, and really what we're talking about today are the measures that need to be taken in order to have stable funding going forward. This is such a strong interest that we were able to get an A&S workshop going at the Summer Water Congress. That turned out to be really valuable. It brought together reservoir operators. We had legislators from the Water Resources Review Committee involved. We had congressional staff members. We also had managers from CPW, DNR, as well as the leadership from Colorado Water Congress, kind of assembling to make strategy on creating a sustainable program going forward. I would say that one of the things, the recent discovery of mussel larvae, or also known as veligers, in Green Mountain Reservoir was definitely a wake-up call that came right as we were assembling to try and figure out our strategy going forward. It really makes the case for needing to keep the inspection program tight. It was really, even though Green Mountain Reservoir, these villagers were found, but that's because there was proactive monitoring going on. As soon as those larvae were discovered, there were proactive measures to control and tighten access into Green Mountain. We believe there's a good chance of avoiding the establishment of adult mussel populations given this proactivity, as was the case in Pueblo Reservoir, Blue Mesa Reservoir, and Granby Reservoir. Those were all cases where these villagers showed up. They were discovered early. The measures, the access restrictions were put in place, and these reservoirs are now certifiably clean. We really are seeking the same outcome with Green Mountain Reservoir. So when fully operating in the past, the inspection program has cost about $4.5 million a year. That's the CPW piece of it. It's really going to be something like, or the CPW is the biggest piece of that. The need is something more like $4.7 million going forward. There has been an increase in the Colorado minimum wage, and that's going to affect the cost of running the inspection programs. And then we also need to continue to keep an eye out for any kind of areas that need additional attention. And again, the Green Mountain Reservoir is definitely a wake-up call in that regard. We need any holes in this inspection program need to be identified and dealt with as quickly as we possibly can. So in addition to the state level funding needs, the Water Congress workshop also engaged discussions about the need for additional federal support. And I think when you hear the legislative proposal coming forward, that's included. Another thing that we all felt, that all of us that have been involved with these programs felt was extremely important, is to have stiffer penalties for violating these A&S laws. One careless or reckless boat owner putting an infected boat into any of these reservoirs can create a problem that cannot be cured and could spread throughout the state. So we're pleased that the enforcement is being stepped up on this. Not only do we need stiffer penalties, but we're trying to make headway in terms of coordinating law enforcement among federal, state, and local law enforcement people that in our area have stepped up pretty actively to deal with this. So at the conclusion of the summer workshop at Water Congress, it was agreed that a bill would be drafted for consideration by the Water Resources Review Committee and also for consideration by the State Affairs Committee of Water Congress. And I'm very pleased to say that the draft bill has been produced, and that bill is going to be the subject of the next presentations coming from Doug Krieger and Doug Vilsack. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Emily.
Thanks so much, Mike. So I am going to turn the controls over to Doug Krieger. And I think that Doug Krieger and Doug Vilsack plan to kind of present together here. So Mike, I think if you go ahead and turn your webcam off, that would be great. So our next speaker, Doug Krieger, graduated with a bachelor's from Michigan State University and a master's from Colorado State University, both in fisheries and aquatic sciences. After working for MSU, a private biological consulting firm, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, he joined Colorado Parks and Wildlife in 1980. He has held positions as a research scientist and area aquatic biologist in Fort Collins, then as a senior aquatic biologist in Colorado Springs for almost 30 years. He has been in the position of Chief of Fisheries for the past 3 years. And then also, I'm just going to go ahead and introduce Doug Vilsack as well. Prior to joining DNR, Doug was the founding executive director of the Posner Center for International Development, a shared workspace for international development organizations that engage over 100 tenants and members in Colorado. He is also the founder of Elephant Energy, a social venture that distributes household solar products in Southern Africa and the Navajo Nation. Doug first traveled to Namibia to work for the World Wildlife Fund in 2005 and has returned on numerous occasions to continue his work with community-based conservation organizations. Doug was a practicing natural resources attorney in Denver before his work at the Posner Center and received his JD from the University of Colorado Law School and his bachelor's from Colorado College. Take it away, Doug.
Thanks to the Colorado Water Congress and the newly named Water Education Colorado for sponsoring, and thanks for all of you for being here today. Since our A&S program began in 2008, we've been fighting the good fight to protect our water resources, our infrastructure, and our fisheries. Although our mission has been to protect and eradicate all aquatic invasive species, some of which shown here, our focus has been primarily on zebra and quagga mussels. So far, it's been a very successful program, particularly considering the consequences that the other surrounding states are facing. As of January 2017, we were actually mussel-free in Colorado when we delisted Pueblo Reservoir. However, in spite of our best efforts, our state is again positive for mussels. As Mike mentioned, in August this year, we got confirmation of quagga mussel veligers at Green Mountain Reservoir. We don't know how these veligers got in, if they were washed out of a boat, if they were reproduced naturally in the reservoir. However, it was disappointing that our 2017 operations at Green Mountain Reservoir had been reduced from almost 40% from the amount we used when we first initiated our inspections in Green Mountain Reservoir in 2010. So at Green Mountain, we have containment mode in effect now, which means that boats must go through a high-risk inspection, and they need to be contaminated when exiting, or at least by the time they come to the next receiving water. Many of these boats travel throughout our state that are coming from Green Mountain, so what we've seen is boats likely to go to Chatfield, to Cherry Creek, Boyd, Pueblo, 11 Mile, and Dillon Reservoir. It's important to note that no adults have been found in Colorado. We have actively been monitoring since we got our confirmation at Green Mountain, but so far we've found no veligers and obviously no adults. We've been closing down illegal boat ramps that have been particularly plentiful with the reservoir being full. These boat ramps have both been found on private and public lands. But we have faced this situation before. As Mike mentioned, we've had several reservoirs in the past listed here that have been positive for veligers since 2009. But with our testing and monitoring, we've all confirmed that those are all negative at this point. Again, we've never found an adult mussel in Colorado, and I credit our extensive and effective program for halting the further inoculation of veligers coming off of boats coming from out-of-state sources. However, as it's already been mentioned by Ken, Colorado is definitely susceptible to invasion. Mussels are distributed from as far north as Manitoba, as far south as Mississippi, in a wide range of waters and different physical and chemical and biological characteristics. We know with certainty what those water quality parameters are that are necessary for mussel establishment, and we've been tracking those throughout the state. It's clear that all waters in Colorado have suitable conditions for mussel survival and reproduction. With all our water susceptible to mussels, the key to our program is preventing the spread to Colorado. So far this year, we've intercepted 25 boats that have had attached mussels. That's exceeded our number that we had last year. Unlike Colorado, states to the east and west of us continue to see more waters become positive for mussels. The Great Lakes region and Mississippi Basin states are of concern, but as Ken has already discussed, Lake Powell continues to be our greatest threat due to the number of boats that are coming from Lake Powell and moving back and forth to Colorado, and also the close proximity to our borders. This is obviously why the Dolores Water District is so engaged with the ANS program. But with Lake Powell boats coming to so many reservoirs, as Ken showed earlier, this threat is really a concern to all water managers, both on the east and the west coast. I'll turn it over to Doug now.
Thank you, other Doug. So I think what I'd like to go through is just chat again a little bit about how we got into this challenge with funding for this program, and then as well talk a little bit about some of the legislative solutions and kind of solutions that we've come up with over the last year, really thinking through this problem. So as was discussed a little bit before, the ANS program traditionally through CPW has received money from Tier 2 of the Severance Tax Fund. Kind of how this works, and I won't get into all the details, is that severance tax comes in mainly from oil and gas revenues into the state. It is distributed between the Department of Local Affairs, DOLA, and DNR. Most of it in DNR goes to fund CWC, various water infrastructure projects, and some of the core operations of the Department of Natural Resources. And when all those core operations are covered, then when that amount of money is covered, then it spills over into Tier 2. And so that's where we get Tier 2, which technically should be composed of kind of not as important of programs. And the challenge is that some of these Tier 2 programs, turns out, are quite important to keep running. Traditionally, CPW has received its full allocation of Tier 2 funds. That's kind of dipped a little bit over the past few years, but last year really kind of came into crisis mode because of the BP Americas case, which again I won't get into the details about, but basically allowed oil and gas companies to deduct capital costs, and because of that, they could then go back and ask for refunds for a lot of the capital costs they hadn't, or costs of capital that they hadn't asked for refunds for deductions for in the past. So all of a sudden we had an issue where severance tax would have to refund over a number of years these kind of back taxes that need to be paid, which resulted last year in zero money flowing into Tier 2. So none of the Tier 2 programs received funding. For ANS, again, that was kind of $4 million that we didn't have. There was some funding left in reserve, but it got us into a situation where we basically had to go out and ask water providers, I think as was discussed before, to come up with the funds to make sure the program could continue running at least kind of on a diminished basis throughout last year. We also were benefited from some funds last year from the legislature, from the general fund, which CPW really never receives. CPW is an enterprise agency, so it generates all its own revenue in-house through license fees, boat registration, those types of things. So we basically lived through last year, thanks to the legislature, thanks to water providers, and are now back in the same situation, albeit with less in reserve. Not really a clear idea about whether the legislature wants to give us another $3.5 million in the general fund. So as was mentioned before, we spent the last year really talking through solutions, thinking through ideas to develop a more stable base of funding for this program as opposed to Tier 2 severance tax, or in addition to Tier 2 severance tax. And what we've come up with is really just kind of a number of things that have been included in a bill that's now in front of the Interim Water Resources Review Committee. I'll go through these kind of one by one. The core of it is basically just trying to generate more revenue, as CPW normally does to fund its programs, from an aquatic nuisance species stamp. So any of you that are hunters or know of the habitat stamp, kind of a similar idea, basically just supplemental funding to ensure that we can keep waters, keep access open for boaters. And so this particular stamp would cost $25 for in-state boaters, $50 for out-of-state boats kind of coming into the state, one-time annual fee. And those stamps would end up generating $2.3 million to provide a stable base of funding for this program. In addition, the idea is that we could increase these stamp fees over time. CPW has all sorts of challenges just because it is an enterprise agency around making sure that we're not losing the value of our money every year. Some of our fees were allowed to increase, 2% for the consumer price index every year. Some of them aren't, and we always get into trouble when we have to go back over and over and ask for increases in fees. So part of this is to ensure that the consumer price index is built into this, so over time, we can increase these fees 2% a year just to keep up with inflation. Another piece of this is to maintain that Tier 2 severance tax funds. It might not be reliable, but it is a good other source of revenue when it's there, and we have managed it in the past to keep the program going even last year. Obviously, we can't deal with years where we have zero coming in the door or multiple years with zero in the door, but that's still a good source of funding for the program when it's there, and we can help manage it over time if we have this other base of funding from the A&S stamp. Also, just some cleanup. Parks and Wildlife, for some of you that know that world, combined a number of years ago, and so we have two funds, one fund for A&S in the park side of things and one on the wildlife side of things. So just cleaning up that and combining those two funds so it's easier to administer. As I think we talked about before, we also have issues with penalties. So the penalties for instance, knowingly importing quagga mussels or zebra mussels into the state are very low. So you could drive a boat into the state, as often happened last year, with quagga or zebra mussels all over it at this point in time, and you could be fined $150, and CPW would clean your boat up for you for free. So part of this bill as well addresses some of those fines, penalties, increases them to make it very clear that this is an important issue for us, and you can't just expect to bring your boat in the state and not be punished for it. And then as well, making sure that CPW, for those really egregious cases, can charge folks to clean off their boat. I think perhaps Mike showed the picture of that boat earlier that took, a lot of CPW staff time to clean off, and at the end of the day, it was returned to its owner, no mussels on it for free. And as well, just really trying to really think through, how we make sure folks from out of state are really involved in this as well. Really thinking through, folks bringing in boats from Powell and other places so they understand that they're part of this program as well. So, as I mentioned before, this bill has been drafted. It's in front of the Interim Water Resources Review Committee right now to determine whether it will be a bill that is kind of sponsored or supported by the committee itself when the legislative session starts in January. The members will vote on it this week, and then we'll basically move through the legislative process as any other bill would, but kind of with that extra stamp of approval that the Water Resources Review Committee, which is generally made up of folks from most basins around the state and from a number of legislative districts, really understands that this is an issue and really support what we're trying to do to resolve it. So yeah, that's kind of where we are right now with the bill. And I think the next committee hearing on the bill is next Tuesday, October 31st. And as the public or folks that are interested in this bill, I know there's a public comment period for folks to come in and express their support or have any questions about the bill to come talk about that at that time as well. And then finally, I would say, and on this slide too, we don't have a lot of control over federal funding and trying to get more federal resources for this bill, but it is a significant part of the problem. We manage or are involved in have a lot of federal reservoirs, federal facilities in the or here in Colorado, and so part of the bill as well is trying to nudge the feds to really step up and try to play a part in this as well, or much more than they have been on the funding side, to make sure that federal reservoirs, federal facilities are also kind of being protected and not all on the backs of CPW funding. So I think with that, we're ready to open it up for some questions if folks have them.
Yeah, thanks so much, Doug and Doug. Ken, if you would like to go ahead and pop your webcam back on, that would be cool. And I'll check out our questions. So the first question comes from John Wiener. What liability may appear for private reservoirs and ditch companies that fail to act or enforce inspection requirements? John's concerned for small operations which run on year-to-year minimum operational funding.
Well, I'll take a crack at that, Emily, and that's certainly what I was trying to get across. Because CPW has done such a great job, and I guess the receiving end has been the recreational community, I think a lot of water managers didn't quite see this as the threat that it really is. And that would be my case is you definitely have to get into the public conversation. Now, locally, we had private ditch companies that went ahead and just shut down reservoirs. We also have some limited use of one of the private ditch company reservoirs. And it really depends who owns property around your facilities. Do you have a lease with CPW? Are there other entities involved? Like McPhee is a large reclamation project with Forest Service management. So as a water provider, the first thing you have to do is get into the conversation and get control of the access for inspections. From there, CPW can help you with risks and how much you do have. Because if you do get infested, it's very expensive. Well, you cannot get rid of them, and you're going to be cleaning all your pipes and intakes at a minimum. Anybody else?
So just a reminder, if you do have questions, you can type them into the questions pane of your GoToWebinar toolbar. It is pretty close to the bottom. So we have another question coming in from Elizabeth Schroeder. Elizabeth asks, what are the best ways to clean equipment like waders and prevent the spread of ANS?
Well, I'll take a shot at that, Emily. You know, what we do when we disinfect boats is to use basically hot water. So that's water that's more than 140 degrees. These mussels, particularly veligers, the larval stage, are susceptible to desiccation. And so just by drying, making sure everything is fully dried, put it in a warm location. Some people put things in the trunk of their car during the summertime, but somewhere where things will dry out. And if things are wet, you need to remove as much moisture as possible. That's really the best way to avoid most of these waterborne invasive species.
Thanks, Doug. Our next question comes from Mark Fuller. Mark asks, last year there was an ANS funding bill in the legislature which failed. Why did it fail, and what is the strategy for making sure that the current proposal fares better?
I think I'll take that one.
Go ahead.
So the bill that failed last year, House Bill 1321, was kind of a combination of issues for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. So it had a piece that was dealing with the aquatic nuisance species problem, a piece dealing with other funding challenges we have with parks and with license fees for hunting. So this year, this piece that's running through the Interim Water Resources Review Committee right now is just that portion of the bill last year that was focused on aquatic nuisance species. And I think that's very helpful because it really focuses in on the issue. The bill last year had a lot of moving parts, and frankly, most of the conversation around that bill was around the hunting components of the bill, and not really the aquatic nuisance species of the bill. So I think the benefit of having it separate is that we can really focus in on the problem and focus in on some of these challenges that we have, and be very clear about the fact that this funding needs to come in the door from these fees and be used for this very specific purpose, dealing with major challenge that CPW and the state has. As well, we're getting started a lot earlier because that bill had so many moving parts. It got started later in the legislative session. The benefit of going through the Interim Water Resources Review Committee is that bills that are supported through that process are introduced on day one of the legislative session. And so we will be starting kind of right out the gate as long as we can get support from the committee on that end. So I think those are the two main points. And I think we're also much more organized this year. We have had this working group, literally hundreds of folks kind of engaged in thinking through what some of these strategies might be to solve this problem. This webinar, again, all far in advance of when this bill is going to hit the floor and legislators are going to want to hear about it. So I would say folks on this webinar are also part of the solution. There is this committee hearing next Tuesday. There are other opportunities to contact legislators and to ask questions. And we really want folks to be involved and make sure that that folks at the State House hear that this is a challenge and we need to come up with some solution for it.
Awesome.
I would just like to add to that the failure last year sure wasn't due to any lack of support from the water community. So that was much appreciated. This year we have a separate bill and much more focused, therefore, on just ANS as a separate standing bill. And again, we're asking for that type of support that we saw last year. We had a lot of good testimony from individuals and agencies to committee hearings last year. That's what it's gonna take this year to help us go over the goal line.
Thanks. So our next question comes from, let's see here, Amanda Fernley. Amanda asks, are there any anticipated penalties for industrial water uses that transfer ANS out of private public waters? And then really quickly, Amanda also asks, any technologies being evaluated for disinfection beyond hot water? Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think I'll speak to the second part of the question. I'm not sure I understand the transfer. Because this problem exists in the Midwest, and you saw pictures from the lower Colorado, there are things that will kill these mussels, and they tend to be similar chemicals to what we're using on aquatic vegetation, copper-based chemicals. You can use chlorine, and you can use the hot water, as was noted, and they are exploring UV, much like disinfectant on wastewater. The issues are, can you stop your water? If the answer is no, then to get rid of adults, you have to use mechanical means. You have to actually shut down and physically remove mussels from a grate or a pipe. Then you end up having to have chemical or UV treatment nonstop in your system for all piping approximately 12 inches and below. And so say you're a non-potable system like an irrigation company or a power plant with cooling water, I now have to own treatment systems put up on all my small piping. If you're a municipal provider, you would potentially have to get a redundant on your raw water system, much like your chlorinated system. And although you can kill them in these confined locations, that's why we don't have a lake-sized treatment that's allowed environmentally to actually kill them off. And that's why it becomes a forever expense as far as we know, because no one has yet figured out how to control them. With that, Doug, if you can try the first part of the question.
Yeah, sure. And I think that's been a question in terms of transport within water delivery systems, but that's not really the vector that's threatening Colorado. We're a headwater state, so water flows out of the state rather than coming into the state. We're largely negative, and so water can move throughout our system without much repercussions. We have found doing studies that these villagers are, they're susceptible to desiccation, like we've mentioned, but they're also susceptible to pressure changes. And so in most pipelines that are particularly going across the Continental Divide. We have a lot of pressure changes, and those are probably going to decimate these veligers. So again, our focus is really on sources coming from outside the state, coming into the state, and those are transported largely by boats.
And just to add to that a little bit, I mean, I think we're not necessarily dealing with this problem now because we don't have, we haven't found adults in the state and have had an outbreak in a reservoir. I think, you know, the reason that Green Mountain is particularly troublesome is that it's high up in a watershed. And so, you know, if we start having problems in reservoirs like Green Mountain or other reservoirs that are high up in a watershed, you're not just talking about Green Mountain, you're talking about everything downstream in the Colorado River corridor. And I think that's the real worry in Colorado, being a headwaters state, even though, you know, we're not going to get them flowing into our state. If we are contaminated or infected, we will be impacting everybody downstream, and pretty much everybody is downstream from us.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it's like the pictures that Ken showed earlier were the changes of distribution of zebra and quag mussels across the United States over the last, 20 years, and those are, a lot of those are directly related to downstream movement of water. Even though they don't do so well in piped type situations, they sure can move downstream in flowing water, and it makes everybody within this state and surrounding states susceptible to any problems that we might incur.
Thanks. So we have a couple more questions. From Ethan Scott. Ken, should water districts be getting control of access or looking to partner up with the recreation providers? Touch on your work with USFS and Montezuma County to control access. It is a great partnership.
Well, thanks for the question. And it is very local specific, and CPW does run the inspection programs and has proven themselves as a national leader in how to deal with this. Unfortunately, it's labor intensive. And with that said, you do have to put local coalitions together that value your water source. Because ultimately, we're all going to charge our customers if I have to start cleaning grates that are 200 feet deep once every couple of years. So we've had great support from our county and other managers around the lake. But CPW does, not all lakes are at equivalent risks. And that's somewhere where you really do need to get into the weeds with CPW and make a local program that fits your community. And although our community is not excited about all the access control that we've done, we're going to meet with them in a few weeks in another public meeting. We're having biannual public meetings. It's a work in progress, and we are getting good buy-in, and ultimately it's the public that's going to support us both with fees and compliance. So it does take some work, and that's why we've stepped up, and there's no shortcut around some of that local communication.
And we have a priority system, like kind of Ken mentioned, on the priorities of waters that we actually perform boat inspections and decontaminations. We don't do a 100% job. There's reservoirs in this state that are boated where we can't afford to have it, and they're low risk, but they're still at risk. And so that's why we need to partner up as much as we can. Right now, we can't do this alone. We need a lot of help. Even with that help right now, we don't have a complete system in place for all of our reservoirs. So that's vitally important, and we try to work with as many partners as we can to bring out as much coverage as we can to state to cover those high priority waters.
And that's why as well, I mean, the inspection program is obviously a really important part of what CPW does, but just the kind of messaging, clean, drain, and dry, just really getting the word out to everybody and anybody that's in the water in the state, and making sure that they know that they need to be spreading the word about this issue and the impacts that these types of invasive species can have on our waterways, and frankly our ability to use our waterways is really important too. So spread the word. Make sure your friends know what they should and shouldn't be doing around our waterways in the state.
Thanks so much, Doug, Ken, and Mike. I also want to thank Water Education Colorado and all of our attendees. These presentations wouldn't be possible without your support, so we really appreciate you. Again, I did record this session, and so I will email all of you. I have the attendee list, and I'll also email contact information for our speakers today. So thanks so much, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Good afternoon, everybody.